Is the GNU in ICU? Mbalula contradicts Zille, Zille contradicts Mbalula, the Freedom Front Plus and the PAC just want to come along for the ride? And how can we have a cabinet without an agreement? All that and more in this installment of SMWX. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. Oh, and have you noticed that there's some new decor on our set? Thank you so much. Our 100,000 subscribers plaque has arrived. Thank you all for continuing to grow this channel and turn it into the important platform it's becoming. We see you and we appreciate you. This is SMWX, where we analyze South African politics, and there is so much to talk about since we last spoke, fam. So in today's episode, I want to take a look at all that's been happening around the coalition agreements, or shall we say disagreements, and focus in on what all of these contradictions that have begun to emerge mean. So that'll be the first part. And then in the second part, I want to consider the question of cabinet and President Ramaphosa's decision around cabinet, look at some of the constitutional aspects, but also the different portfolios and how those could be or could not be divided and what that would mean. Also, the question of the timing of his announcement and when we might be able to think about expecting a cabinet, and talk about why it's much more complex this time than in previous occasions. So let's start with the contradictions that have begun to emerge in the so-called government of national unity. Well, it's a lot of things, but so far it's definitely not united. Government of national unity, by the way, because I've continued to maintain that this is not a government of national unity, words actually mean things, and wearing my hat as a political scientist, we can't just stretch terms that have a very definite meaning to mean whatever politicians want them to mean. I guess the last standing argument about this so-called government of national unity is that, well, because the call was inclusive and because the ANC invited everybody, that automatically turns it into a government of national unity. Nonsense. Just because you invite a lot of people to a government doesn't, by that fact, make it inclusive. What makes a government inclusive is that those who are invited actually come. Think about it. If you had a party and you invited 10 of your friends, and only 6 or 7 of them came, that doesn't make it a party of friendship unity. It just means you invited everyone, but only a few came, even if it's a majority. What makes a government of national unity a government of national unity rather than a coalition is that it has broad representation, not just in its invitation, but in its actual substantive outcomes. And I'm glad to see that many in the media have begun to move away from this term, because I think it is concealing more than it's revealing. We have a coalition, a multi-party coalition, and as another analyst on this channel, Tessa Dooms, has said, I think this is a coalition of the willing. I think that's a great way to put it. So having said that, we certainly don't have unity yet, because what did we see? Shout out to Clement Manyathela on his show Face the Nation for excellent work in exposing some of the contradictions between the parties. So after the first sitting of Parliament and the election of premiers in Gauteng and KZN, it seemed like all was going well for the ANC, the DA, and its other partners. But suddenly, this week, we've begun to see serious differences. So what did we have? Firstly, we had ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula going on live TV and failing to answer very simple questions about the nature of the agreement that had been signed between the ANC and the DA, which laid the basis for the election of President Ramaphosa, Togo Didiza as Speaker, and other provincial posts in KZN and Gauteng. And on this channel, we had constantly said, having looked at the agreement, and check out my interview with Prof. Pierre Defos, constitutional law expert, where he looks at the agreement, we had constantly said, this is very surprising. The ANC has got itself into this agreement where it requires the DA to agree with the ANC for anything to move. And likewise, it requires the ANC to agree with the DA for anything to move. And if you look at this agreement, the text of the agreement, there is no other way of reading it other than it establishes what I would call a mutual veto. So the DA is able to veto anything that the ANC would do. But similarly, the ANC is protected in that it can also veto anything that the DA or other partners would do. So in order for the government of national unity, so-called, to make cabinet decisions, you would need at least the agreement of the ANC and the DA. You can think of the agreement like this. It works firstly on the basis of consensus. So the idea is that cabinet will try its best to reach consensus, at least in this framework agreement. What does consensus mean? It means that everyone can agree to the decision. However, we all know that politics is a terrain of disagreement. So what happens if, say, a small party with one seat at the table disagrees? Well, then we move to the next level. And where there are disagreements, then we move to a level that's called sufficient consensus. This was an idea that was first developed in the democratic negotiations at CODESA. And sufficient consensus, which is kind of an oxymoron, because consensus means all agree, but sufficient consensus means that even if all don't agree, then there will be a certain threshold of agreement that will take the next step. And in this agreement signed by the ANC and the DA, we have sufficient consensus set at, and I quote, 60% of seats in the National Assembly. So sufficient consensus exists when, according to clause 19 of this agreement, 1, all parties have had the opportunity to express their views. So presumably around the table, everyone will say, I agree, I disagree. 2, despite reasonable attempts to resolve disagreements, so you can't just steam ahead to sufficient consensus, you have to see if you can derive consensus and find common ground. There is no general consensus. And then 3, here's the key clause, parties to the GNU representing 60% of the seats in the National Assembly, not in the Government of National Unity. And 4, any party that disagrees has been able to formally record their objections. So this clause is very clearly drafted. It says that sufficient consensus emerges when parties that have 60% of the seats in the National Assembly, not in the Government of National Unity, are able to find consensus. 60% just happens to be ANC plus DA. Now, ANC plus any other party won't get you to 60%. ANC plus IFP won't get you there. ANC plus PA won't get you there. ANC plus Freedom Front Plus won't get you there. ANC plus PAC won't get you there. Even if you combine all of them, you still don't get to 60%. So the only way you can get to 60 is if the ANC and the DA agree. So what does that mean in summary? The DA can't act alone because they only have 22% of the seats in the National Assembly. Nor can the ANC act alone because they only have 40% of seats in the National Assembly. However, when you combine the two, then they can act alone in the absence of general consensus. So this was put to Fikile Mbalula, and he seemed not to accept what the clear terms of the agreement state. He said that there was no way that the DA could exercise a veto over the ANC, and that if they disagreed, the ANC essentially would have the latitude to make decisions with other partners or maybe even on its own. It remains unclear what the ANC's position is. And Mdumiseni Ntuli tried to advance this argument in subsequent days as well. Now, Helen Zille, of course, came on screen soon after Mbalula. And although I think Zille was unwise in terms of her tone, she was absolutely correct in terms of her overall interpretation, although she seemed to be confused between seats in the GNU and seats in the National Assembly. She came on and said, Mbalula's wrong. The agreement talks about broad proportionality. They took out this idea of proportionality or the word proportionality, but it says that the GNU must ultimately reflect the outcomes of the election, which means that parties who got certain percentages should broadly be reflected in those percentages in government. So let's say the ANC got 40% of the vote, much more than the DA. That means they must have much more cabinet seats, but it should be roughly proportional to the overall picture. So the ANC couldn't take like 90% of cabinet because they don't have 90% of the vote, right? Furthermore, Zille pointed to clause 24, which some people have said is the sunset clause of this framework agreement. I've just decided, by the way, that we must just treat this as a comedy at this point, because that's the only way to get through this. Like, it is hilarious how much and what we have seen over the last few weeks. PAC and Freedom Front Plus are now in the same government. Maybe we must just give the country to PAC and Freedom Front Plus and let them figure it out from here. So Orania will stay, but then it will be expropriated at the same time. So there'll be an expropriated Orania. So the land will be brought back, but it won't. I think that's the most coherent thing that this GNU can probably produce at this stage. Anyway, let's get back to this thing of consensus. And the spirit of this agreement is that parties must consult widely and that decisions must be taken together so that no one party has the ability to steamroll their agenda. That's the spirit. And it makes sense, because otherwise it's not a government of national unity. It's not even a coalition. It's just an ANC government with small party decorations. So this clause 24 says, in keeping with the spirit of an inclusive government of national unity, it is agreed that the composition shall be discussed and agreed amongst the existing parties whenever new parties desire to be part of the GNU. So Zille's interpretation of that is that once the parties have signed, any new additions have to be agreed between the existing parties. And the ANC has tried to stretch that interpretation to say, no, that's not about when parties sign, it's when the government itself is formed and anyone wants to join that government. But that's not what the agreement says. If they wanted it to say that, they should have put that in the document, because that would have clarified things further. The agreement seems to suggest that it is a framework agreement for a government of national unity. That's the whole point of the agreement. So it seems to say, in the plain meaning, that anyone who wants to join after parties have signed requires consultation between the parties, which makes sense. Otherwise, joining the government of national unity wouldn't require consultation, which is the whole point of a government of national unity. No one can make decisions unilaterally. Thanks for watching SMWX. Before we get back to the episode, I just wanted to let you know the 4 ways that you can help support this channel if you want to see us growing bigger and better to keep you more entertained and informed. The first way is you can invite me to speak at your company, your school, your institution. You'll see the contact details down below. The second way is that you can become a member of this channel. Become a member, or you can give us a thanks. You'll see there's like a heart with a $sign in the ribbon below this video. Buy me and the team some coffee for this episode. The third way you can get involved is you can advertise on the channel. Now, I'd much rather the community of viewers would be advertisers on this channel than me going out to people who don't really know about SMWX and trying to explain it to them. So if you're a viewer and you have a business and you want to partner and you love this platform, let's partner on this channel. And then finally, you can buy merchandise, you can buy books. All this is in the description down below. Now let's get back to the episode. So what the ANC has then tried to do, as it seems to have dawned on them late that they have got themselves into this agreement, which requires a high bar of consensus, is to try and walk it back. And in their attempt to walk it back, you can see the DA is very unhappy. And like you know, I have made many videos criticizing the DA. I think their policy platform is potentially harmful and deeply unpopular, and I think their failure to acknowledge the racial injustices of South Africa's past is shameful. But on this issue, I'm afraid they're right. Because the ANC cannot want to build a 2019 government on a 2024 budget. The ANC just doesn't have enough power to throw its weight around as if it has a majority. The DA has given the ANC the presidency. They've given the ANC the speaker. They've given ANC Premier of Gauteng. They've given all these very important positions in good faith. And now the ANC turns around and says, oh no, we'll just decide what happens with cabinet and we'll give you some crumbs here or there, from a position of 40%. The DA is well within its rights to say, hold on, you need our 20% for a comfortable majority in the National Assembly. And in order to give you our 20%, you have to be inclusive, and we demand a proportional share of cabinet. We've already given you the presidency and the speakership. We now actually need to get some power too, as parties to this agreement. And it seems that at that moment, the ANC is incapable and unwilling to concede how much power it has lost in this election. So where we stand is the ANC once again has a choice. And I keep saying this, and the ANC keeps failing to actually make a decisive choice. Will they steam ahead? Will President Ramaphosa steam ahead and just appoint a cabinet that the DA might not like, because it's ultimately his constitutional gift to do so, and risk the DA pulling out because they have been marginalized despite being an important player and despite having a signed agreement with the ANC, in which case the ANC falls back on a potential minority government with a lot of small party partners that is deeply unstable? Or does the ANC and does President Cyril Ramaphosa take a step back and try to renegotiate with the DA, in which case they're going to have to give the DA quite a lot of cabinet? Those are the choices before the president. Because if the DA pulls out, not only would that be furthermore hilarious, because the government of national unity would have lasted like 2 weeks. But if the DA pulls out, then what? Then things get very tricky for President Ramaphosa and the ANC, because then their government doesn't even have 50% of the seats. So suddenly a motion of no confidence becomes very risky. And the EFF and the DA, who will both be wounded by how they've been treated by the ANC, can come together and say, next week, motion of no confidence. Bye-bye, President Ramaphosa. Let's kick off a new government of national unity. Yay, new inauguration. So the ANC would be very weak if they antagonize the DA too much, which means the DA can demand a lot of power, but the ANC is not going to like giving up that power. So they must choose. Or does the ANC run back with its tail between its legs to the EFF and say, oh no, even though we've isolated you from the government and we've criticized you on public platforms for being arrogant and for wanting to destroy the ANC, we actually want you back into this relationship of unity. And please come back and don't make any major demands. Just sit quietly with your nice 2 seats in cabinet and help us get over the line. I don't see the EFF buying that. The EFF will realize very quickly that the ANC can no longer negotiate from a strong position because they know the DA won't go with them. So the EFF can extract big concessions. And once again, rationally speaking, they should extract those concessions for their constituency, just as the DA should extract those concessions. And so the ANC will be in a tough position. And again, it must choose: give up cabinet power or be a weak government. One or the other. So that's what I'd like to say about where we are in these fissures that are emerging in the GNU. let's have a look at the second part, because all of this revolves around the cabinet itself. And there are some really interesting aspects to this that we need to take into account. The first thing is we've got a bit of a conundrum, and we've got a tension between political decision-making on one hand and constitutional decision-making on the other. We've got a bind between backroom political deals and what the Constitution says and what power it distributes to the president. Because on the one hand, we've got this coalition agreement or framework agreement, which says that power must be equally divided or proportionally divided according to the electoral outcome, which is very different to what the Constitution says, which is that the president has sole discretion to appoint the cabinet. And I pointed this out many times, and no one was hearing me when I was saying it, but we're right here, right now. Once you appoint the president, constitutionally, it's the president's decision who the cabinet is. And so the president can go rogue and dismiss what his party tells him, dismiss what other parties tell him or her, inshallah, one day, and just appoint the cabinet. There's nothing unconstitutional about that. However, the danger of doing that, of just blindly following constitutional prescripts without having regard to the party political consequences, is that the president then becomes politically weak because those he sidelines can attack the presidency. And again, referencing my conversation with Pierre Defos, he said something interesting which deepened my understanding of the Constitution. The Constitution is not just the text and the case law that interprets that text, usually coming out of the Constitutional Court. It's also the unspoken conventions and subtext that lie beneath the explicit text. And so even though the Constitution says, yes, only the president can decide cabinet, the subtext is that the president must also consider the political calculus as he does that. Otherwise, the motion of no confidence threat kicks in. So it is true, constitutionally speaking and technically speaking, that only Cyril Ramaphosa can decide his cabinet. But if he overplays his hand, then there could be political backlash, which could leave him very vulnerable, fragile, and possibly even out of office if he antagonizes too many parties. So yes, the decision is Ramaphosa's, but it's not Ramaphosa's. It's everyone who is party to this government's decision, even though he may be the main role player. Furthermore, Ramaphosa has the ability to divide power within his cabinet and has a lot of discretion and flexibility to do that. So Section 85 of the Constitution, which talks about the executive authority of the president, in other words, just his capacity to control things in the executive branch of government, like cabinet, says that the executive authority is vested in the president, that's of the republic, and the president exercises the executive authority together with the other members of the cabinet. So the Constitution envisages that the president is exercising this collaboratively with those he appoints into cabinet. And I think this section and other sections are going to become really important over the next 5 years, because what does together with mean? How much discretion do cabinet ministers have to take decisions, to implement policies or regulations? And to what extent must cabinet decisions be collective? And where is the line on collective decision-making versus individual cabinet minister decision-making, especially in a case where cabinet ministers come from different parties, different ideologies, and may be pursuing opposed agendas? So Ramaphosa is in a difficult position, and unless he is able to straddle these divides and unite these parties and give them enough of what they want, the GNU will remain in ICU. And I think since about 2018, people have been begging President Ramaphosa to become decisive, to get a handle on things, to move forward. And his response has always just been, kick the can down the road, try to create whatever consensus you can, don't really make a decision, try to make all decisions and no decisions. And unfortunately, the space is narrowing for that kind of leadership style. Some kind of decisive and bold, unifying action is going to be required. Having said that, I want to look at cabinet portfolios as they stand and give you a guide around what the important portfolios are and what the kind of discussions that might be going on around cabinet might be, who gets what, where, and when. So I think the first interesting question, of course, is about the deputy president. Now, the deputy president can actually be seen as a relatively ceremonial role. They only really have the power delegated to them by the president or given to them, distributed to them by the president. Typically, that role has also had the important power of being the leader of government business. What does that mean? In a nutshell, when you look at the Constitution and the National Assembly rules, the leader of government business is an interface between cabinet, on the one hand, which is drafting a lot of early legislation or proposing legislation which will go to the National Assembly, but also implementing and executing laws, and the National Assembly itself, which is ultimately responsible for considering and passing and debating these laws, or the executive branch and the legislative branch. So there's kind of like an interface there, which is the leader of government business. The leader of government business will take the proposals from cabinet and then transfer them into the National Assembly and also try to set up time for when these proposals will be discussed, make sure that ministers, on the one hand, are at the kind of committees that they need to be at to make sure that they're accountable for the legislation that's being proposed. And that's a really important role, which has traditionally been played by the deputy president. Its role has been underplayed because the ANC always had a majority, so they were always able to convince parliament to do what the executive wanted. But now, I think that role will become really important. Why am I telling you all of this? The reason is that it seems to me that what the DA is eyeing is they're not going to take the deputy president. They're happy to sacrifice that, I think. But they'll take minister in the presidency, and then they will want the president to assign to that minister that they be the leader of government business. And I think that's what John Steenhuisen is after. He doesn't mind whether you call it deputy president or you call it minister in the presidency. What he cares about, which is smart, is what powers that position has. And if John Steenhuisen does become the leader of government business, then he might as well be the deputy president. Right? So I think you may well get an ANC president and even an ANC deputy president, at least in one scenario, but then you'll have this minister in the presidency who actually becomes the leader of government business. At least that's what I think the DA wants, and that's why I think the ANC is suddenly starting to realize that they're going to have to give up quite a lot of power. So that's one thing. Or they just resolve that the DA gets the deputy presidency and the leader of government business. But I think they understand that that could create backlash, because while John Steenhuisen is very popular within his constituency, he's not very popular outside that constituency. So there's that whole question that I would keep an eye on. How will they do this deputy president, leader of government business thing, and which party will get it? Then I would keep an eye on the security cluster of portfolios, which is police, which is state security, which has been moved into the presidency right now. What happens with that? And there are also then questions of justice and correctional services. So really this idea of the criminal justice system, but also the intelligence gathering system and the policing power. And I think the ANC will be quite keen to hold on to as much of that as possible. And then I would add to that international security and relations portfolios, so DIRCO and defense. That is really the heartland of state power, and I think the ANC will be at pains to really hang on to as much of that as possible. And I think we could even see appointments from outside cabinet into things like DIRCO, and I would support that. I think Naledi Pandor has been a brilliant minister, and even though she's not on the parliamentary list, the president can appoint 2 people from outside parliament. And if I was Cyril Ramaphosa, I would reappoint Naledi Pandor if she's keen to serve. So there, I think you're going to see quite a lot of ANC, if not full ANC representation there. But that means that the ANC will have to make a trade-off, because if they want to take all of the security and international portfolios, they have to give up some of the economic portfolios. And here, once again, when I read closely what the DA seems to be wanting, I think there's a proposal, if the DA can't get finance, that one of 2 things happen. Either Enoch Godongwana carries on because he's seen as a market-friendly finance minister, or there's some kind of compromise finance candidate from outside, which the ANC and the DA will agree on. So no one will get finance, but they'll both agree on the finance minister, and they'll become some kind of technocratic finance minister, probably from within the banking sector. I think it's quite sad that there's this revolving door between big finance and state finance, but that's a story for another day. So I would watch very closely finance. And then when we talk about other economic portfolios, I would watch very carefully DTI and competition. That's trade and industry. And why is that an important economic ministry? It's important because this is really the gateway for South Africa's foreign direct investment push. So if an opposition party is able to get control of DTI and demonstrate that they have increased foreign direct investment, that's good for them in the next election. And I think the DA, again, to the extent that they would be in this arrangement and they're able to find the ANC, would be very keen to say, how do we take control of foreign direct investment ministries and demonstrate our capacity to increase foreign direct investment? Then we can go into an election and say, hey, look what we did. DTI is also important in terms of trade, in terms of positioning South Africa's industrial policy, and also our policy of importing and exporting goods and what that mix looks like. So it's really interfacing with the rest of the world from an economic perspective. And I think any opposition party would really want to get their hands on that portfolio. Now, you've also got other portfolios, and this is another area where I think opposition parties will be keen. And that is, right now we've got a Minister of Electricity and we've got a Minister of Energy. And those 2 have always sat uncomfortably. And then you've got public enterprises. So you've got 3 ministries which are all dealing with this energy crisis that we have through Eskom, electricity, and energy. And the president has divided powers differently across his term. Again, if I'm the DA or another opposition party, if the DA gets kicked out, solving load shedding is your easiest route to the next election. If you can say, hey, give us energy and electricity, or one of the 2, or merge those ministries into one ministry, and let us take South Africa to a path where we never have to worry about load shedding again, that is a great message to go into another election. So when I look at the DA's platform, or I look at opposition parties, I'm thinking, can I get control of the load shedding ministries? Try my best to turn around Eskom and leave South Africa not just in this position of energy poverty, but maybe energy abundance in the next 5 years. So I would look very closely at those portfolios. Another one I would look at is public administration. Can we turn around the state? And to Cyril Ramaphosa's credit, he's actually put a lot of work into reconfiguring the state. The fact that he hasn't implemented a lot of that work is, well, neither here nor there. But would an opposition party want to run public administration to the extent that they can then influence laws and the implementation of the laws around depoliticizing and reprofessionalizing the civil service, which is a fundamental, important contribution to the country, because then no matter which government comes in, we can have a more stable and professional public administration. Finally, if the ANC and DA are still able to find each other, once again, which I think is doubtful right now, but the ANC doesn't have a lot of options. I had a look at the DA shadow cabinet and the DA National Assembly list. in order to find out who are the high flyers in the DA that are likely to get ministerial positions if they are distributed to them. And I came up with a few names that I would keep an eye on if the ANC and DA really are going down this path together. Obviously, we know John Steenhuisen is gonna get a high position if that happens. I would definitely think that Sizwe Kgobe would be in line. She's not only the chief whip in parliament, but has played a very prominent role in this election. I look at someone like Leon Schreiber, PhD, not a big fan of his ideology or his political views, but he's clearly an important player within the DA. So I think he would be in line. I think someone like Kevin Milam is clearly an influential voice in the parliamentary caucus. Someone like Dion George, particularly around finance and the economy. Dean McPherson seems to be an increasingly important voice within the DA. Natasha Matsone, again, she's been in the shadow cabinet often. She's also high up on the list. And then you've got Solly Malatsi as well, who is an important communications voice, but he's also high up in the party and he's high up on the list. Another person who's high up on the party and on the list, although he's relatively young, is Ashor Sarupen. Because of his relative youth, I'm not sure whether they would put him into a ministerial position, but I think he will be one to watch in the future in the DA as well, because he seems to be an influential voice. He's number 2 on their national list, and he's in the upper echelons of the party. So those are just some DA names that I would keep an eye on if this ANC-DA coalition does materialize, because that's who I think will ascend to high office. You've also got a Michael Cardo, maybe, who's not necessarily high up in the party leadership, but he's clearly influential within parliament. So those are the kind of names I would expect to see playing an important role in the state going forward. Thank you so much for watching SMWX once again. Just to remind you that, your views count. Down below in the comments, we always have a really interesting discussion. You don't have to agree, you don't have to disagree. I say this all the time, but I'm not a member of any political party. But my interest on this channel is creating current affairs debate to inform you, but also to expand just agreement and disagreement on SA politics. So I look forward to your comments. This is the place to go to get more informed on South African politics, and then you can make your mind up from there. Like, share, subscribe. If you're listening on a podcast platform, please give us a positive rating. But most importantly, tell your uncle, tell your aunt, tell your son, tell your daughter, tell your friend. Share it into your WhatsApp group where you have intense political conversations. And let's keep spreading the fire. What does that mean? Spread the fire is figurative, not literal, please people. It's spreading the word of this channel and help take us to 200,000 subscribers from 100,000. Aye. Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel, so why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights.